On the morning of October 14th, 1987, Midland, Texas was just another quiet oil town in West Texas. The sun was bright, the air dry, and the streets carried the smell of dust and gasoline. Ordinary, unremarkable. But inside one small backyard, in a modest neighborhood where everyone knew everyone else, life was about to change forever. 17-year-old Reba McClure, a young mother, was doing what millions of mothers do every day, juggling children, phone calls, and chores. Her daughter, Jessica McClure, was just 18 months old. She was a curious toddler with big, round eyes and chubby cheeks, still learning words, still stumbling with the wobble of new steps. That day, Jessica was playing in the yard while her mom was watching over several other children. Reba stepped inside the house for just a moment to answer a phone call. When she returned, Jessica was gone. At first, Reba thought Jessica had simply wandered behind the shed, or maybe gone inside with the other kids. But then she heard something, an echo, faint but unmistakable, a cry. She looked around, panicked, and realized that the sound wasn't coming from the yard or the house. It was coming from below, from the ground. Jessica had fallen into an abandoned well shaft in the middle of the backyard. The well was an old relic, a narrow steel pipe that once tapped water decades earlier. It had been covered with a rock, but at some point the cover had been moved aside. The opening was only 8 inches wide, barely enough for a grown man's arm to fit through. Yet somehow, Jessica's small body had slipped in. She fell 22 feet straight down, landing in the darkness. Reba screamed. Neighbors rushed over. Someone called 911. The first police officer arrived within minutes. He lay down on the ground and shouted Jessica's name into the well. At first, there was silence. Then a sound floated up, a soft cry, thin and terrified. She was alive. But the problem became clear immediately. No adult could fit into a shaft only 8 inches across. No rope could safely loop around her. No ladder could be lowered. Jessica was stuck, wedged between rock and steel, 22 feet under the earth. The news spread fast. Within an hour, dozens of people crowded the yard, neighbors, police, paramedics, firefighters. They peered down into the hole, each one whispering the same question. How do we get her out? The first attempt was simple. Drop a rope with a loop, try to snag her arm or foot, and pull her up. But Jessica was jammed too tightly. The rope caught nothing. Another idea. Lower a long pole with tape or hooks. But the shaft bent slightly, making it impossible to reach her directly. Every attempt failed. As the crowd grew, so did the panic. Jessica's muffled cries echoed up the shaft, reminding everyone that time was ticking. She had been down there nearly an hour already. Oxygen was limited. Fear began to ripple through the backyard. What if she suffocates? The fire chief made a bold call. If they couldn't pull her up, they'd dig down beside her. Crews brought in heavy drilling equipment and marked a spot about 3 feet away from the well. The plan was to dig a parallel shaft, a hole big enough for an adult rescuer to climb down, and then tunnel sideways to reach Jessica. It was risky, but it was the only chance. The drilling started just after noon. The machines roared to life, spitting out dirt and rock. Neighbors stood by with shovels, ready to help. Reporters began arriving, their vans lining the street. Television crews set up cameras. By early afternoon, the rescue of baby Jessica was live on the evening news. Meanwhile, Reba collapsed in tears. She knelt by the well, calling her daughter's name again and again. Sometimes Jessica responded with a faint whimper. Sometimes she was silent. And those moments were the most terrifying of all. In those early hours, no one knew if the little girl would survive. They only knew one thing: they weren't leaving until she was safe. By the time the sun started sinking lower in the sky that October day, the backyard in Midland, Texas, had transformed into the center of a full-scale rescue operation. Police cars lined the street, red and blue lights flashing. Firefighters hauled equipment back and forth. Neighbors brought food, blankets, and flashlights, trying to help in any way they could. And at the heart of it all was that tiny hole in the ground, barely big enough for a grapefruit, holding the life of a little girl. Jessica had now been trapped for several hours. Rescuers took turns lying flat on the ground, speaking into the darkness. "Hang in there, baby. We're coming. We're not leaving you." And sometimes, faintly, they heard her, a whimper, a cry, even the sound of her humming. Those sounds gave them hope, but also reminded them of the urgency. Paramedics quickly realized that Jessica wasn't just stuck. She was wedged. Her body had twisted on the way down. One leg bent up near her face, the other stretched downward. She was essentially folded in half inside a tube of steel and rock. Moving her without the right approach could dislocate bones, tear tissue, or worse. Doctors on site warned that Jessica's survival hinged on two things: air and time. The well wasn't sealed, so she was still getting oxygen. But how much? No one knew. And then there was dehydration. A toddler can only go so long without fluids, especially in shock. Every minute mattered. The fire chief explained the strategy to the growing crowd. Drill a vertical shaft parallel to the well. Once they reach the same depth as Jessica, dig a horizontal tunnel to reach her. Send a rescuer through that tunnel to bring her out. It sounded straightforward, but the ground beneath Midland wasn't ordinary soil. Just a few feet down, drill bits began hitting solid rock. The drilling slowed to a crawl. What they thought would take a few hours began stretching into an all-night ordeal. Crews brought in pneumatic jackhammers. The yard shook with the pounding of steel against stone. Dust filled the air. Neighbors covered their mouths with shirts. Each strike of the hammer echoed like a heartbeat counting down time. Word of the trapped toddler spread quickly. Within hours, every major TV network had cameras rolling. CNN broadcasted live updates. Anchors on the evening news told America about the little girl who had fallen into a well in Texas. And people watched, by the millions. From New York to California, families turned on their televisions and prayed. Many couldn't tear their eyes away. It wasn't crime, it wasn't politics, it was raw human survival. Soon the rescue site was flooded not just with locals, but with journalists, photographers, and satellite trucks. The glow of camera lights bathed the backyard in harsh white, making night look like day. For Jessica's parents, there was no privacy. Every tear, every plea was captured on film. Reba, Jessica's mother, stayed near the well as much as she could. Sometimes she sat silently, staring into space. Other times she cried out, "Baby, Mommy's here! Hold on!" Her husband, Louis "Chip" McClure, paced restlessly, hands clenched, desperate for something he could do. At just 18 years old, he was still barely a man himself, but now the whole nation saw him as the father of America's child. Neighbors formed prayer circles in the yard. Churches across town held vigils. Strangers dropped off food, coffee, and blankets for the exhausted rescuers. Midland might have been a small city, But for those hours, it felt like the entire world lived on that one block. As the drilling dragged on, frustration built. The shaft beside the well was only half finished. The horizontal tunnel hadn't even begun, and Jessica had already been trapped more than 10 hours. Paramedics listened through microphones lowered into the shaft. At times, they heard her humming softly, the tune of Winnie the Pooh, her favorite song. The sound broke hearts and stiffened resolve. It meant she was still conscious, still fighting. But it also meant she was waiting on them. Doctors worried about her circulation. Being stuck in a bent position for so long could cut off blood flow, leading to tissue death. They whispered about amputation, about permanent injury. Nobody dared mention the worst possibility aloud. As midnight approached, crews switched shifts. New rescuers arrived, fresh but anxious. Floodlights illuminated the backyard like a football stadium. The drilling continued, slow and grueling. Sparks flew from the rock as steel bit into stone. Above ground, people prayed. Underground, Jessica waited, and the world held its breath. By the time the rescue entered its second day, the effort had transformed into something larger than Midland, larger than Texas. It had become a story gripping the entire United States. But on the ground, in that backyard, it still came down to a tiny child trapped in an 8-inch hole, and a crew of exhausted men and women refusing to give up. The rescue crews quickly learned that West Texas soil could be merciless. At first, they had drilled through softer layers of dirt, but soon the drill bits met hard rock, caliche, and granite-like stone. Every inch was a battle. Progress slowed to just 2 inches per hour. The vertical shaft had to be dug at least 29 feet down, deeper than Jessica's position, to allow a rescuer to tunnel sideways. After nearly 20 hours of pounding, hammering, and clearing debris, the crews had managed to reach about 30 feet. That part was complete. Now came the horizontal tunnel, the most delicate and dangerous stage. But digging sideways was even harder. The machines barely fit into the narrow shaft. Men working underground had to squeeze in shoulder to shoulder, operating jackhammers by hand, chipping away at unforgiving rock. Every strike of the drill echoed up to the surface, where families and reporters waited in tense silence. Above ground, paramedics kept constant watch on Jessica's condition through a microphone lowered into the shaft. At times, she cried. At times, she whimpered. But the most haunting moments came when she was silent. In those pauses, the rescuer's heart sank. Was she unconscious? Was she slipping away? Doctors explained the risks to the public: dehydration, lack of oxygen, circulation loss, hypothermia. Jessica had been folded in half for hours. Blood might not be reaching her legs properly. If circulation didn't return soon, she could lose a limb, or worse. The parents clung to every update. Reba knelt by the shaft, whispering prayers and sobbing until neighbors gently pulled her back. Louis clenched his fists so tightly his knuckles turned white. They were just kids themselves, 17 and 18 years old. But now they had to endure the most public, agonizing weight imaginable. By now, television networks were broadcasting live around the clock. CNN, ABC, CBS, NBC all had cameras on site. Anchors told viewers every new detail: how deep the shaft was, how long Jessica had been trapped, how many rescuers were involved. Americans tuned in from coast to coast. Office workers watched during lunch breaks. Families gathered around televisions late into the night. People who had never heard of Midland now knew every inch of that backyard. And the image of Jessica, stuck underground, singing Winnie the Pooh, lodged itself into the nation's collective heart. Letters and phone calls poured into Midland, offering prayers and even wild suggestions. Lower a smaller child down, pour in foam to lift her up, attach suction hoses. Rescuers had to gently dismiss most of these ideas. They were too risky, too experimental. Still, the attention mattered. The people of Midland felt the weight of the entire country standing with them. By the 24-hour mark, rescuers were bone-tired. Men crawled out of the shaft dripping sweat, faces coated with dust. Their hands blistered from holding drills. Some had to be treated for exhaustion right there in the yard before others took their place. Tension mounted. They were making progress, inch by inch, but not fast enough. The horizontal tunnel, which they thought would take a few hours, had barely begun. At this rate, it could take days. And Jessica had already been in the well more than a full day. The fire chief considered calling in outside specialists. That's when the phone rang with unexpected news. A company in Houston had developed a new machine, one that used pressurized water mixed with sand to cut through rock. It was called a water jet cutter. The catch? The machine was hundreds of miles away. They'd need to fly it in. As equipment was arranged, Reba and Lewis could only wait. At one point, Reba tried to climb down the shaft herself, desperate to reach her daughter. Rescuers stopped her gently, explaining she could get stuck too. She broke down, sobbing in the arms of her family. Jessica's grandmother stood nearby, gripping her rosary beads, whispering prayers over and over. Neighbors joined in, forming circles of prayer in the yard, some holding candles even as floodlights blazed above them. Through it all, little Jessica's faint voice occasionally drifted up the shaft. Once a rescuer reported hearing her softly sing the words, "Winnie the Pooh, Winnie the Pooh." The sound brought grown men to tears. It meant she was alive, but it also meant she was waiting on them, her tiny world still trapped in darkness. As the second night fell, the backyard looked like a construction zone under siege. Heavy floodlights lit every corner. Generators hummed. Jackhammers clattered. Reporters' microphones caught every sound. Jessica had now been underground more than 30 hours. Every hour increased the danger. Every hour stretched the nerves of rescuers thinner. Still, they kept going. For the little girl they had never met, but who now felt like family. For the parents who could barely stand from grief. For the nation that was holding its breath. And somewhere in that darkness, folded in half in a space smaller than a mailbox, baby Jessica kept waiting. By the morning of October 16, 1987, Jessica had been trapped for nearly 40 hours. The backyard was no longer just a neighborhood scene. It looked like a war zone. Piles of rock and dirt surrounded the shafts. Heavy equipment groaned and clattered. Dozens of rescue workers rotated in and out, their faces drawn with fatigue. Reporters shouted questions over the roar of generators. And at the center of it all, deep below the earth, an 18-month-old child still clung to life. The breakthrough came with the arrival of the water jet cutting machine from Houston. Mounted on a truck, it looked like a piece of science fiction, a device capable of slicing through solid rock with a narrow stream of water and sand under extreme pressure. Rescuers had pinned much of their hope on this machine. For hours they had struggled with jackhammers, making painfully slow progress. The water jet offered something faster, more precise, and less likely to send vibrations that could harm Jessica. When the machine roared to life, the effect was immediate. Rock that had resisted drills for hours gave way under the relentless spray. Dust clouds filled the air, thick and choking. But in the control tent, engineers monitored every cut with military precision. Inch by inch, the tunnel inched closer to the little girl. While the machine chewed through stone, rescuers discussed the next and most dangerous step: sending someone into the horizontal tunnel to reach Jessica. The space would be incredibly tight, no wider than 18 inches. Whoever went in would need to crawl belly first, with barely enough room to breathe, and then work in the dark to free a toddler wedged in rock. It wasn't just dangerous, it was terrifying. That's when an unusual volunteer stepped forward. Ron Short, a local man who had been born without collarbones. His condition allowed his shoulders to collapse inward, letting him squeeze through narrower spaces than most people could manage. Ron offered to crawl through the tunnel, convinced his unique body shape made him the perfect candidate. The rescuers considered it seriously. Ron's condition was real, and he was willing, but there was one problem. He wasn't trained for high-stress rescues. A wrong move underground could kill Jessica, or both of them. With heavy hearts, the rescue coordinators thanked him for his bravery but declined the offer. Instead, they turned to someone who was trained for dangerous extractions: Robert O'Donnell, a 27-year-old paramedic from Midland. Tall, wiry, and steady under pressure, Robert had already proven himself in emergencies before. Now he was being asked to do something no training manual could ever cover: crawl into a rock tunnel and bring a baby back from the brink. As the hours stretched past the 45-hour mark, rescuers completed the horizontal tunnel. It now ran directly toward the spot where Jessica was wedged. Engineers measured distances carefully. Less than 2 feet of rock separated the end of the tunnel from Jessica's tiny prison. Inside the cramped shaft, workers passed equipment hand to hand: air hoses, lights, ropes, blankets. They knew that once Robert reached her, everything had to move fast. Jessica's condition was fragile. The longer she remained bent in that unnatural position, the greater the risk of permanent damage or death. Robert O'Donnell prepared himself in silence. Fellow rescuers described him as calm, almost detached, as though he had placed his emotions in a box for later. He smeared petroleum jelly on his arms and chest to help slide through the narrow tunnel. He tied a rope around his waist in case he needed to be pulled back quickly. Above ground, the crowd of onlookers grew restless. Some had been standing there for 2 straight days. National news anchors delivered live, play-by-play coverage. In living rooms across America, families leaned forward on their couches, hardly blinking. It felt like the entire country was waiting for one man to crawl through a hole. Robert slid into the tunnel, inch by inch. The shaft was so tight that his helmet scraped rock on both sides. Breathing was difficult. The air smelled of dust, sweat, and machine oil. He pushed forward with his elbows, his flashlight beam bobbing against the rough walls. At the far end, he caught his first glimpse of Jessica. She was caked in dirt, her face pale, one tiny arm twitching weakly. Her body was twisted painfully, one leg bent backward, the other stuck upward. Her eyes fluttered, barely opening. Robert reached out, but quickly realized he couldn't move her. She was jammed too tightly. Worse, the tunnel was still just a little too narrow. He had no leverage. If he yanked too hard, he could break her bones. With frustration burning in his chest, Robert backed out slowly and reported the grim truth. They needed more room. The rescuers faced a gut-wrenching choice. To widen the tunnel further, they'd need to bring the water jet cutter closer to Jessica, risking noise, vibration, even accidental injury. But without it, Robert couldn't pull her free. After a tense debate, the decision was made. Cut again. The machine roared back to life, sending sparks and mud flying. Every cut was measured, cautious, deliberate. Above ground, Jessica's mother wept openly, clutching her husband's hand. Reporters whispered that the rescue had entered its final stage. Success or failure would come soon. For the first time in nearly 2 days, hope surged. The path was almost clear. The rescuer was ready. And America watched, holding its breath, as the world turned its eyes to a hole in the ground in Midland, Texas. The night of October 16, 1987, had stretched into the early morning hours of the 17th. Jessica had now been underground for more than 56 hours. The air was cold. The crowd above was exhausted, but a strange sense of anticipation filled the yard. The tunnel was finally wide enough, and paramedic Robert O'Donnell was ready to make another attempt. With his body greased in petroleum jelly once again, Robert slid into the horizontal tunnel. Each inch forward was a fight against the crushing weight of earth and stone. His flashlight illuminated dust swirling in the narrow space, turning the air into a choking fog. When he reached the end, he saw Jessica again, still alive. Dirt clung to her cheeks. Her tiny fingers twitched. Her lips moved faintly, as though whispering to herself. Robert steadied his breathing and whispered, "Hang on, baby girl. We're here." Jessica's position was worse than rescuers had imagined. Her right leg was pinned awkwardly above her head, twisted so tightly it looked dislocated. Her left leg bent down beneath her body. She was wedged at such an angle that it seemed impossible a child could survive. Robert worked carefully. He wrapped her torso with a soft strap, planning to use it to pull her free. But when he tugged gently, Jessica didn't budge. She was stuck, the rock pressing her in place like a vice. Minutes dragged by. Sweat stung Robert's eyes. His arms ached from the cramped space. Above ground, rescuers and Jessica's parents waited in silence, watching the rope attached to Robert's waist for any sign of movement. Finally, Robert tried a new approach. He shifted her leg inch by inch, massaging it free from the rock. Jessica whimpered softly but did not cry, too weak after 2.5 days without food or water. It was a sound that pierced his heart, but also gave him strength. After nearly half an hour, something gave way. Jessica's tiny body slid forward, just enough for Robert to tighten his grip. At 7:55 a.m., Robert O'Donnell shouted up the tunnel, "I've got her!" A surge of electricity ran through the crowd above. Workers dropped their tools. Parents gasped. News cameras zoomed in, the world about to witness history. Slowly, carefully, Robert backed out of the tunnel, inch by inch, cradling Jessica against his chest. The rope around his waist tugged gently as rescuers guided him upward. And then, in a single, breathtaking moment, Robert emerged from the shaft, carrying a dirt-covered toddler wrapped in white gauze. Jessica's eyes blinked against the sunlight. Her body was limp, but her chest rose and fell. She was breathing. The crowd erupted. Reporters cheered. Neighbors cried openly. Paramedics rushed forward, placing oxygen on Jessica and loading her onto a stretcher. Flashbulbs exploded as photographers captured the instant America had been praying for. Within minutes, the rescue was broadcast live across the country. People in offices, classrooms, and living rooms cheered as though they had just won a national championship. President Ronald Reagan called it a miracle. First Lady Nancy Reagan phoned Jessica's parents personally. The image of Robert O'Donnell emerging with baby Jessica in his arms became one of the most iconic photographs of the decade. Newspapers the next morning carried it on their front pages with headlines like, "Saved" and "Jessica is free." Jessica was rushed to Midland Memorial Hospital. Doctors treated her for dehydration, shock, and a serious foot injury from her twisted position underground. She required 15 surgeries in the years that followed and lost a small toe to gangrene. But against all odds, she survived with her spirit intact. Her parents, Reba and Chip, were overwhelmed with gratitude. For them, the sight of their daughter alive was nothing short of divine intervention. For Robert O'Donnell, the experience was both his proudest moment and a heavy burden. In the years after, he struggled with the weight of fame and the trauma of what he had witnessed underground. Sadly, his life ended in tragedy in 1995. Yet to the people of Midland and to the world, he would always be remembered as the man who pulled baby Jessica from the earth. Jessica herself grew up quietly, away from the spotlight. She lived a relatively normal life, eventually marrying and having children of her own. For her, the story was always something she had to learn from others. She was too young to remember. But to everyone else, she remained a symbol of hope, endurance, and community. The rescue of baby Jessica was more than a local emergency. It was a global event that reminded people of the power of unity. Neighbors, strangers, engineers, paramedics, and volunteers all came together for one purpose: to save a child. Nearly 4 decades later, the story is still told not only as a piece of history, but as proof of what can happen when people refuse to give up. Jessica McClure's survival is a testament to courage, hers, her family's, and the rescuers who gave everything to bring her back to the light.